This presentation will look and focus on the historical context of post-colonial New Zealand. We will start off by looking at the pre-Maori settlement of New Zealand, followed by the settlement of New Zealand by Britain. We will also have particular look at the Treaty of Waitangi and how that historical document relates to post-colonial issues within New Zealand. New Zealand, or Aotearoa as it is called in Maori, which means the land of a long white cloud, is an island country situated in the southwestern Pacific Ocean. The country geographically comprises of two main land masses, the North Island and the South Island. There are also several small islands which help make up the New Zealand landmass. New Zealand is situated about 1,500 kilometres east of Australia across the Tasman Sea and roughly 1,000 kilometres south of Pacific Island areas of New Caledonia, Fiji and Tonga. Because New Zealand is so remote, it was one of the last lands to be inhabited by humans. According to Maori tradition, the first explorer to reach New Zealand was a Polynesian navigator Kupe. By using the stars and ocean currents as his navigational guides, he ventured across the Pacific on his wakahuara, which is a voyaging canoe, from his ancestral Polynesian home of Hawaii. It is thought that Kupe made landfall at the Hokianga Harbour in Northland around 1,000 years ago. After the initial discovery of New Zealand by Kupe, according to most recent and reliable evidence both from archaeological and natural sites, historians believe that the initial settlement of New Zealand took place between 1250 to 1300 AD, with Maori oral traditions speaking of several wakas, which are canoes, arriving at different parts of the country at this time. These tribes who arrived did not identify themselves as Maori, but identified themselves by the groups and sub-tribes that they arrived in. It is still unknown why and how the different tribes arrived on the shores of New Zealand, with some historians suggesting that they were blown off course and taken by currents to New Zealand and the arrival was accidental. However, it is most likely that it was a planned settlement and the people arriving in New Zealand came to get away from overcrowding, war, sickness from their home islands. The early settlers lived in small hunting bands, and the food that they lived on and hunted were seals, fish, flightless birds such as the moa, which is depicted in this picture. These moas were hunted until they were extinct. After the extinction of the moa, Maori began to become cannibals as there was not too much other food going around, and raids to neighbouring villages and tribes for food became commonplace. The picture up in the right hand corner is a picture of a cannibal feasting ground. The early Polynesian settlers also brought with them kuma, which is sweet potatoes, and yams. These grew well in the normal North Island. Extensive kuma gardens supported relatively large settlements, but even still there was a large amount of pressure on the resources, which, as I said before, there was always raids and trading going on to capture resources. The Polynesian dog and rat were also brought over by the early Maori settlers, but for an unknown reason chickens and pigs from the islands were not introduced to New Zealand by these early Maoris. Even with the cannibalism and lack of resources, Maori tended to live reasonably well. Their life expectancy was low by modern standards, but compared to that of the Europeans in the same era, it was about the same. Before the arrival of Europeans in New Zealand, the Maori population has been estimated to be about 100,000 people. Central to Maori culture was the concepts of mana and utu. Mana meant status, while utu meant revenge. Because these two were central to the culture, it led to widespread warfare as individuals and tribes tried to gain more respect and status, while also revenging wrongs caused in the past. War was a major part of Maori culture, and to not engage in war for conquest showed that you were weak, which meant you lost mana. The Maoris lived in and built fortified villages called pas, which were situated on strategic places of land and on defensible positions. After the settlement of Europeans in New Zealand, these pas evolved into great defensible positions that could withstand artillery fire for weeks and not be destroyed. They became like a modern redoubt. However, the greatest achievements in the pre-European Maori culture was the carving of wood for canoes and buildings, and the fashioning of stones and tools and ornaments. The most prized possession was the green stone, which was only found in the South Island mountains. Because of this, trade was very important to the Maori tribes in New Zealand. Many of the trading routes that the Maori used in New Zealand were by river. The first Europeans to discover New Zealand were the Dutch in 1642 under the command of Abel Tasman. He charted the west coast of the country, and it was him who gave the name of New Zealand, which was named after the province of Zeeland in Holland. However, even though he discovered New Zealand, Abel Tasman did not set foot in the country as the natives were too hostile. It was not until 127 years later that the next European arrived in New Zealand. The name of this explorer was Captain James Cook. He first visited New Zealand in 1769, and it was the first of 3 voyages to the country. He circumnavigated and mapped both islands and returned to Britain with reports on the country's resources, especially the kauri trees which were needed for the spars on ships, and the inhabitants of the land, which he described as fierce warriors. The French then visited New Zealand in 1775 in an expedition by French explorer Marc-Joseph Marion du Fresnay. However, his crew and him were massacred by the local Maoris. This just goes to show how fierce the Maoris were indeed to visiting people. For 50 years after Sydney was founded in 1788, New Zealand was an economic and cultural outpost of New South Wales. Most of the people that came to New Zealand during this time were whalers, traders, missionaries, or escaped convicts. It was also during this time that the major Maori and European interactions started happening. The first European town grew at Russell, where whalers began calling into the Bay of Islands for food and water. From 1790s, Maori produced pork and potatoes for this trade. The other main area of early interaction between Maori and Europeans was the Foveaux Strait sealing grounds, which is at the bottom of the South Island. The presence of these traders drew Maori to particular places, and having a European living among them gave some tribal groups an advantage in the race to acquire European goods, especially firearms. Many of these different tribes wanted to have these Europeans because it meant that they'd be able to get guns, and with them they'd have advantage over other tribes. A Sydney chaplain, Samuel Marsden, founded the first Christian mission station in the Bay of Islands in 1814, and by 1840 over 20 stations had been established. From missionaries, Maori learned not just about Christianity but also about European farming techniques and trades, and also how to read and write. The missionaries also transcribed the Maori language into written form. Christianity would become important for Maori, but they were slow to convert. Muskets traded for flax and potatoes had a greater impact in the 1820s and 1830s than religion ever did, and these muskets escalated the killings and tribal conflicts. The Ngāpuhi tribe, led by Hongi Hika, devastated southerly tribes, and the Ngātoa, under Te Raupraha, attacked Ngātahu in the South Island. Some estimates of the musket wars was that over 30,000 Maori were killed in these wars from 1820 to 1830. Disease during this time introduced by Europeans also helped to wipe out a large proportion of the Maoris. In the 1830s, the British government came under the increasing pressure to curb lawlessness in New Zealand, to also protect British traders and to forestall the French, who had imperial ambitions also. The missionaries, for their part, wanted to protect the Maori from the effects of European settlement. Because of this, the British government decided to draw up a treaty to help protect everybody living in New Zealand, but to also gain sovereignty over the country and keep it out of the hands of rival powers. On the other hand, the Maori chiefs also wanted a treaty drawn up to regulate settlement and control land sales. They also wanted to be able to keep the balance of power, and by signing the treaty they thought that's what they would get. In 1833, James Busby was sent to the Bay of Islands as British resident. At Busby's instigation, Northern chiefs adopted a flag in 1834 and signed a Declaration of Independence in 1835. 7 years after Busby's arrival at Waitangi on the 6th of February 1840, William Hobson, New Zealand's first governor, invited assembled Maori chiefs to sign a treaty with the British Crown. The treaty was taken all over the country, as far south as the Foveaux Strait, for signing by local chiefs, and eventually more than 500 signed. Under the treaty, Maori ceded powers of government to Britain in return for the rights of British subjects and guaranteed possession of their lands and other treasures. In later years, differences of interpretation between the English and Maori texts complicated efforts to address breaches of this treaty. The issues that arose from signing the Treaty of Waitangi were complicated because the English text and the Maori text had completely different meanings when they were translated into Maori from English. The following are the 3 articles from the treaty. Article 1. In the Maori version, chiefs gave the Queen the governments or government over the land. In the English version of Article number 1, chiefs gave the Queen all rights and powers of sovereignty over the land. In Article 2, in the Maori version, it confirmed and guaranteed the chiefs the exercise of chieftainship over their lands, villages, and all treasured things. Maori agreed to give the Crown a right to deal with them over land transactions. In the English version of Article 2, it confirmed and guaranteed to the chiefs exclusive and undisturbed possession of their lands and estates, forests, fisheries, and other properties. The Crown sought an exclusive right to deal with Maori over land transactions. In Article 3, in the Maori version, the Crown gave an assurance that Maori would have the Queen's protection and all rights accorded British subjects. This is close to an accurate translation of the English text for Article 3 also. After the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, British sovereignty was proclaimed over New Zealand on the basis of Maori consent, though initially the South Island was claimed on the basis of discovery. Several powerful chiefs, however, did not sign the treaty, but the British Crown was given a considerable mandate for its colonisation plans. It was not an overwhelming mandate and was therefore likely to be challenged in the future. Because of the different meanings of the Treaty of Waitangi, land sales continued to take effect with Maori losing more and more land, mana and balance of power that they had on the country. From these misunderstandings of the treaty, war broke out. War first began in the north of New Zealand in 1845 and 1846 when Honi Heki cut down the flagpole flying the British flag at Russell. Throughout the 1840s there were also land troubles in Wellington and Wanganui, and in the 1850s disputes between Maori over the sale of land to Europeans kept Taranaki in the forefront of the issues. Until the late 1850s the government managed to purchase enough land to meet settler demands, but many Maori became increasingly reluctant to sell their land, which tribes owned collectively. The Maori King movement under the leadership of Wiremu Tamahana grew in part out of Maori resistance to land sales. Potatū Te Whero was elected the first Maori king in 1858. The war in Taranaki and Waikato began in 1860. The flashpoint was Taranaki and the refusal of Wiremu Kingi Te Rangitaki to sell land at Waitawa, which led to war in 1860. The efforts of Maori to regain land were depicted by the settlers as a challenge to British sovereignty. Maori resistance was effectively crushed after Governor George Grey took war to Waikato in 1863-1864. Two chiefs, Te Kuti and Tito Karawa, prolonged the war throughout the 1860s, but by 1872 the wars over land had ended. Large areas of land were confiscated from rebellious tribes. A native land court gave land titles to individual Maori to facilitate sales to the Europeans. After the wars, many Maori drew back from contact with the European settlers, and most lived in isolated rural communities. Maori land continued to pass into European hands, usually by sale through a native land court. In the 1870s, the village of Parihaka became the centre of a peaceful protest, led by the prophet Te Whiti o Rangimai against occupation of confiscated land in Taranaki. In 1881, government forces invaded Parihaka in an attempt to crush its resistance. Some post-colonial effects on Maori regarding the Treaty of Waitangi was that most Maori continued to live in remote rural communities until the Second World War. However, Maori society was dynamic, and there are several movements in the late 19th and early centuries which was evidence of Maori resilience. Post-war Maori migration into the cities, together with Maori anger at their economic deprivation and concern about their mana and continuing loss of land, pushed race relations and the place of the Treaty of Waitangi into the forefront of national life. Issues within New Zealand are still ongoing regarding interpretation of the Treaty of Waitangi, with it being a major issue in the politics of New Zealand even today. A major example of this in New Zealand politics is that the Maori Party was created in 2005 to try and gain ownership of the land back. Maori have also become more assertive regarding the treaty, with some alleging breaches of the treaty and wish to regain and reclaim Maori sovereignty of New Zealand. In 1975, a Waitangi Tribunal was set up, which is used to consider Maori claims and grievances. In 1985, a tribunal was empowered to look at breaches of the treaty since 1840. This tribunal is still going on today, and estimates still say that it will be at least another 50 years until settlements are made. The effect that post-colonialism is still having on New Zealand is that out of the two different cultures that met and clashed in colonial New Zealand, the identity of New Zealanders today has been created by these two cultures merging together to create a hybrid cross-culture, which has in turn made the New Zealand culture what it is. This is identified within post-colonial context as a newly synchronized part of an inevitable ongoing process. James Clifford identifies this in a global issue, a symposium. Thank you for listening. References.